to the first day of the Meadowood Sewalong. I'm really excited to walk you through the process from start to finish. Gathering supplies, picking fabric, cutting everything out, and then actually constructing the garment. Before we even get to all of those steps, I did want to take a minute and talk about the intended fit of the garment. Now, all of this is based on what I felt were the proportions that would make this top work best. But, as you know, when we sew for ourselves, we get to decide. So not only are you sewing for you to fit your body, but you're also wanting to fit your style. So we'll go through any adjustments you can make in the next video. But for now, let's just talk about the intended fit I had when I was sewing this pattern. So the biggest thing is that it is intended to be really oversized. See? Oversized is what I kept telling my testers. So with that, that means that there's quite a bit of ease through the bust, the waist, and the hips, but the top is intended to fit at your high hip. So we'll go through all of that when we're measuring our body and choosing a size. The other thing to remember is that with the shoulder seams up here, this yoke seam, so this is the front yoke and the front lower, the seam is intended to hit you about 5 inches from the apex of your bust. So it's 5 inches up. What this does is this keeps it from basically cutting you right at the fullest part of your bust, which for the most part is not something that looks great on most bodies. I don't have much of a bust, so it doesn't really matter for me, but for many of you ladies that actually have a larger bust, you don't want a top cutting you right across the fullest part. So that's why it's about 5 inches up from the fullest part of your bust. Now, I draft all of my patterns for a height of 5'9" because I am 5'9" and I am my first test fit model. Now, because of that, I also make my sleeves longer to sort of make those proportions work. So something to consider for the sleeve is that it really is intended to fit right at about the point where your elbow bends. So considering really those 3 or 4 things, oversized hits you at the high hip point. You've got the yoke about 5 inches above your bust and the sleeve to about the fold of your elbow. So we will take all of those things into consideration in the next video when we talk about measuring your body, choosing a size, and deciding if there are any adjustments you may need to make to the pattern. So before we move on to all of that really fun numbers part of sewing, I did want to go over the supplies that you will need to gather before we get started. Now, with any of these videos, with any of these steps, I'm sharing how I do things, but I'm also aware that what I do is not right or wrong. It just may be different than some people. So I just ask that you consider the way that I'm doing it. And if it doesn't work for you, that's totally fine. And the same goes for supplies. If you have supplies that you prefer, you do what works best for you. I am just going to show you what works best for me. And hopefully it will help make these steps make a little bit more sense as we begin sewing everything together. Okay, let's start with the most important part of any sewing project. And that is a cup of coffee and jelly beans. If you have ever taken a sewing class from me, you know that I drink a lot of coffee and I eat a lot of jelly beans. I bring jelly beans with me when I sew, and so if you have a comfort drink or a comfort snack, something that just helps you feel comfortable and relaxed and have fun, sewing is supposed to be fun. So make sure you have those. They're just as important as your sewing tools. Now, in terms of actual sewing tools and supplies to gather, let's talk about some of the basics and then we'll talk about the fun, pretty part. Okay, so you will be cutting out your pattern pieces as well as your fabric. Now, you can have paper scissors if you would like. I encourage you to give rotary cutter a chance when cutting out your pattern pieces. I have a rotary cutter that's specific for paper. I find it just works really easy. Lay down the pattern pieces, and just like you would for fabric, you just trace or cut out the pattern pieces. So I have that, but you can also use paper scissors. I am definitely somebody who cuts all of their fabric out with a cutting mat and a rotary cutter. I just find it so much quicker, it's easier, but if you prefer pins and dressmaker shears, feel free to do that. So whatever your method is, make sure you have some sort of tool to cut your fabric. If you are using a rotary cutter, you also need pattern weights of some sort. Now, for years, I used just random cans that I would pull out of the pantry and set on my fabric. It does not have to be anything fancy. There's some great companies that sell pattern weights, but what I have found is the cheapest and easiest option is to actually just go get these huge washers from the hardware store. And funny story about that, I actually went into a local hardware store in my neighborhood in Seattle, and I said, okay, what's the largest washer that you have? And the guy kind of laughed and walked me over to the section with the washers, and it was actually larger than this. And he said that the only other person that has purchased washers this size from them was a quilter. So clearly I didn't come up with this idea, but great minds think alike. So they work really well, they're heavy, and they're not too expensive, and you can get lots. I have lots. And then just put them on your fabric before you cut. You want to make sure you have pins or clips, depending on what your preference is in terms of sewing. I have so many different random pins. I should probably go through and get rid of some of them. Now, you also will need the tool that nobody wants to use, but that we all use every sewing project, and that is a good seam ripper. I really like this Clover, but I also have like 5 or 6 different seam rippers. So just have a good seam ripper. Some people use razor blades, which I haven't tried yet. So whatever you need to open seams, if you need to, you'll have one of these. There are some notches on the pattern, and so you are going to want to make sure that you have either like a chalk liner, this Clover Choco liner, or something like a fabric pen, or I really like using these friction pens. They write really well on the fabric, and then they steam out. Be careful on white fabric. Some of the colors kind of leave a little bit of a mark. But anyways, these are my 2 favorite ways to mark fabric. Today I'll probably be using the chalk since I've got a slightly darker fabric. You'll need some thread snips of some sort because there are lots of threads to cut. A tape measurer. I really like retractable ones. I find the other ones just get all tangled. So some sort of tape measurer for measuring your body, but it also helps just to like check things throughout sewing the pattern. Now, my secret sewing tool that I actually use quite a bit is an Elmer's glue stick that's the washable, the purple one. And the reason I love this so much, especially for a pattern that calls for buttons, is because I can take the glue stick and put it on the back of the button and put it down onto the shirt. And then when it dries, it sort of holds its place. So many times I get like fiddly buttons that want to move around, and so this works great. Also, when you're working with a more shifty fabric, you can use this sometimes with hems as well. So anyways, this is not a must, but I've got so many throughout my sewing room. Now the buttons and the buttonholes. You are going to want to make sure that you have 8 3/4 to 1/2 inch. I say 1/2 inch, but it can be 3/8 of an inch. Some buttons. And because we're doing buttons, you're also going to want to make sure that you have your buttonhole foot for your sewing machine. Some way to do the buttonholes. So you'll want to check your manual if you aren't sure. This is what mine looks like, but make sure you grab one of them. And then we are going to be making our own bias tape for this pattern. I really like making my own bias tape because then your bias tape either matches your fabric or matches the content of your fabric. So many times store-bought bias tape is actually quite stiff and difficult to work with. And so by cutting your own, I think that it finishes the garment so much better. But in order to make your own bias tape, you need some sort of straight edge. I really like the clear acrylic quilting ruler. Mine, you can see, is well loved. But as long as you've got a straight edge and a way to measure the width that we need for the bias tape, that works. So some sort of straight edge for cutting the bias tape. Okay, now the last few things that we're going to need for this pattern, you're going to need some lightweight interfacing. Now, not all fabrics need it. This fabric is a heavier, like linen cotton, and I could have gotten away with not putting interfacing in because you get quite a few layers of fabric with the bias tape, but it's still good to add it in to secure those buttons and buttonholes. Now, you don't need very much, so this is a perfect opportunity to head to your scrap bag, which I can't be the only one that has just like a plastic bag full of random scraps of interfacing. So this is a really great use for those random scraps because you're really only cutting like 2 long strips. I always use lightweight knit interfacing just because that's what I have. I would say it's best to be lightweight. You could do medium weight, but I really wouldn't go too heavy. You want it to add a little strength for the buttons, but not like add too much change to how the shirt lays. And the last most important part of this project is choosing your fabric. Meadowood works great in all types of fabric. So you can have something that's a little stiffer like a cotton linen or full-on linen or something with rayon. I have sewn them in all of the different fabrics. And so it really just changes the feel and the look of the pattern when you use a different fabric. Once you've chosen your fabric, what you're going to want to do is head to this fabric requirement chart and just confirm that you have enough for the project. Now you will notice for 44-inch wide fabric, it says that sizes 18 through 34 do not fit on that width of fabric. Now the reason it says that is because the back yoke and the back lower, specifically the back lower, is cut on the fold. And when you take the width of that pattern piece for those sizes, it is too wide to fit on 44-inch wide fabric, folded in half. But that doesn't mean you can't use that sized fabric. It just means we have to cut those pieces differently. So let me quickly show you how you would do that. If you happen to find a fabric that you love, but that just isn't going to work as the rest of the pattern pieces. So the biggest thing when looking at fabric, considering the grain line of the fabric. So along the outside edges, and this runs the whole length of the fabric, not even just your cut, but on the bolt, you have the selvage. So you've got the selvage down both sides A lot of times it's marked by, you know, in this case it's a white strip. Sometimes there's little holes. There's usually a good way to determine which ends are the selvage or which sides are the selvage. So typically when you're cutting a pattern piece, you would take your selvage and then just make sure that the selvage and the grain line are parallel. So this is how, we'll say this is how we would cut this pattern piece. So the selvage and the grain line are parallel. As I mentioned, for sizes 18 through 34, that back lower is not going to fit on that size fabric. And so you actually have to cut it differently. And that means we're going to be cutting it on the cross grain. And all that means is that you are going to have the grain line of the pattern piece perpendicular to the selvage on the side of the fabric. It's pretty simple. It just means you're going to need extra yardage. So instead of cutting it out with the grain line parallel to the selvage, you are going to turn that piece, fold your fabric, and then cut with the grain line perpendicular to the selvage. So it's just that easy. This can work for anything if you want to give contrast, you know, like a fun contrast to the pattern, especially if you've got plaid or if you've got stripes. You can always cut it on the cross grain, but specifically for 44-inch wide fabric for sizes 18 through 34, that back lower piece will have to be cut on the cross grain. But you can still do it. Just make sure you add extra fabric. The last thing I want to talk about before we wrap up day one of the sew along is that the bias tape yardage requirement is not listed in the pattern. Now, the reason for that is that this pattern is a fantastic way to use scraps, like pieces from your, scrap bin. It's those pieces that are too small to just recycle, but aren't quite enough to actually make a garment. Bias tape is the perfect way to use those. And so because we're going to sort of either be piecing smaller pieces of bias tape together, if you want to use the same fabric or a different fabric, I didn't want to add yardage for the bias tape when you can just sort of use scraps to put it together. The key is it just has to be cut on the bias. And I will walk you through the entire process of creating bias tape, because once you've got it figured out, I think it's actually really fun. So that's it. Day one, gather your supplies, find your fabric, check that fabric requirement chart, confirm you have everything you need, and then come back for day two of the sew along. We are going to be measuring our bodies, looking at the size chart, determining what size we need, and then adjusting the pattern if we need to, so that we get a great fit, not only for our bodies, but for our styles. So I look forward to sharing day two with you tomorrow.